Morning, Chris. Maybe a little bigger than this. I'm having a good hair day. Hey, Gene. Hey, Martin. Morning, Timothy. Oh, and here comes Miles. Miles.
From the Church of Urban Room, the Congress Hotel in the city of Chicago, we bring you music
Making your
by
appearance
Ben
early.
Goodman and his orchestra, stylized swing rhythm. And here's the
I want to miss so many people over here. Hey, Octavio, Mary, Amy, Jean, Mom, Patty, Cindy, Jerry. Hey, Timothy. Hey, Heather. Hey, Sue. Morning, Bridget and Mary Jo. Hey, Casey. Hey, Joanne, Georgia. Hey, Larry. Hey, Stephen over on YouTube. Morning, Ashley. Miles. Miles. Have a seat, okay? Sit down. Sit down. Miles, you are 3 years old. You can sit still. I know you can. You're going to be 4 pretty soon. Hey, Justin. Hey, Ramona. Hey, Becky. Miles is up here purring and purring. How to track if the Frank Hoffman who worked for him in New York is the Frank Hoffman who was my great-grandfather here in Chicago, that'd be a real trick. It's not that uncommon of a name. Capone's work in New York was not really long-term. So it seems, unless we have like some data to connect them, it seems like kind of a long shot. Hey, Cheryl. Miles. He's purring very loud this morning. Wow, good boy. Oh, Miles, you keep knocking the Bruce down. Got to get a second nail on that or something. Morning, Kirk. Hey, Annie, Diane. Morning, Kathleen. Yeah, Kirk, I'll be in Minneapolis in a couple weeks. She got the premiere of Michael Glover Smith's movie Relative in just a couple of weeks in Minneapolis. You and I will be on hand for the showing. Hey, Margaret. Hey, Heather. Morning, everybody. Hey, Cindy in Baltimore. Hey, Lehman. Todd over on Twitch and Eileen. Hey, everybody. Karen and Ronnie is loving graduate school. They grow up so fast. Hey, Karen. Hey, Joanne. Morning, Gina. Hey, Laura. Ronnie's going to school for writing children's literature. She says she's getting a lot out of it already. And hey, her second book's coming out next year. This is the rare time of Miles coming to where the pets are. Usually he like flops down and wants me to come to him. He's gradually learning that you can go where the pets are, as Priya has already figured out. Morning, everybody. I totally lost track of what time it was earlier. Suddenly, oh man, I gotta start. I was over setting up stuff for the Patreon this week. In another case, there's this one criminologist I just keep on running into, and there are times when he seems like a total nut, and times like he seems like the only sensible guy in the room. As is typical with your late 19th, early 20th century alienists. Alright, Miles just noticed something out the window, so he's gone to look. Over here. Oh, Miles loves the window. Maybe I should go open the window for him. He'd love that. It's not that cold out today. Let's move the window open. Let's give it a crack. I'll try to anyway. It'd be great to get to open the window and shit. There you go. Trouble is, it's hard to reach that window, so I have to do nasty stretching.
The Jam Dandies from Benny Goodman's orchestra, and they play a Jim Jam jazzy arrangement of I'm Gonna Sit Right Down and Write Myself a Letter.
Hey, Christine. Morning, Scott. Hey, everybody. I missed a candy bar discussion, it seems. I missed Bar None, which I believe had hazelnut in it. Hazelnut is criminally underused in the candy bar realm. Hey, Amy. Hey, Debbie. Hey, Jim. Morning all around. I went on a shopping spree. I ordered some slippers and a deck of Magic the Gathering cards. I was in a bar where people were playing Magic. I loved this so much 30 years ago. Maybe I could get a deck and play every now and then. Or I don't remember how to at all. I tried to read the things on the cards, and it was like, you know that TikTok where they play the Reading Rainbow theme while your head floats through space? Like that. Guys, you've seen this haircut before. It was on the other night. Hey, Angela. Morning, Carol. Speaking of coffee, I'm going to go quickly refill mine before we get going here. Oh, I got both cats in the window here, too. Morning, Grandma Bell. Hey, John in Oak Park.
Ladies and gentlemen, is your introduction to the Jam Dandies. 8 boys in complete accord as to what...
Yeah, I'm going to go dig through my top dresser drawer. I think I still have some Magic cards from the 90s.
Able direction of Benny Goodman.
But it was, yeah, I've been buying Magic cards and Metallica tickets the last month or so. It's 1994 all over again. All right, we're going to let Benny Goodman do one more tune here. This is a good ending one. This is Benny coming to us from February 10th of 36. At the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. Angelo, yeah, Black Like My Heart. Every now and then I'll get a wild hair to do like a whole bunch of vanilla creamer or something. Lehman, Ronnie's first book is called When the Stars Lead to You by Ronnie Davis. Morning, Brian. Hey, Roberta. Hey, Angela. Sing it, Helen Ward. Octavio, I got you beat. I don't think I bought a pack since 95. Maybe 96. But after I moved to Atlanta, I didn't have anybody to play with. Whereas back in Des Moines, there was like a whole group. This is a good song. So maybe you can see both of the cats for a second. Bria and Miles are both hanging out by the window. Morning, Sherry. Letting Helen Ward finish up singing this song with Benny Goodman and his orchestra. And then we will get started properly. I love this quote up here. Every bozo in this town wants to guzzle a glass of real beer without hearing the angels sing, but it's the poor gink who runs the stuff that gets the bullet through his noodle. Me, I'm through. I wouldn't peddle orange pop at a Sunday school picnic. I gotta assume the reporter punched that up a little bit. Susan, I'm thinking that's Helen Ward. I'm like that with Vampire the Masquerade. I lived with some people, they would talk for a long time and I wouldn't know if they were talking about real life stuff or stuff in the game. Back then, a deck of Fallen Empires cards were like $3. That was a much bigger investment to me back then than it is right now.
Yes, sir, on that old hot trumpet, troublesome trumpet. Well, if Helen Ward doesn't want to be alone, she sings alone.
All right, there's Helen Ward. They just confirmed it. Well, she's going to sing a song called Alone. How do I get you alone? Well, you go to your bank. All right, welcome everybody. All right, I think it's time we get started properly. That was Benny Goodman coming to you live from the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I have been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for, going on 20 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out, including, what picture is this? That's nothing. H.H. Holmes' The True History of the White City Devil, Flickering Empire, How Chicago Invented the U.S. Film Industry, Mysterious Chicago, the book, now on audiobook, to my great surprise. Murder Maps USA, new from Thames and Hudson, a whole coffee table book full of cool, gory pictures. And Graceland Cemetery, Chicago's Stories, Symbols, and Secrets, brand new from University of Illinois Press. But of course, when you're doing Chicago history stuff, you really kind of have to cover the gangsters a bunch. It's just kind of comes with the territory. So, but it is a fascinating thing, trying to keep track of who did what and who really did what among Chicago gangsters and who was working for who. It's a very complicated and tangled web, and it kind of gets to get bogged down by all of this constantly people wanting me to tell them more about the hideout that Al Capone had in their hometown, which he probably never came within 300 miles of. So, but there's hardly a small town in the United States or probably Canada and possibly Mexico that's not rumored to have a place where Al Capone hid bodies or had a hideout or had a resort or something like that. It's almost never true, and some people really don't want to hear that. But this has been part of Chicago's identity really since the start. I don't know if we really had a bigger prohibition scene than other cities did, but ours was better advertised. In the 1920s, Chicago was known as Murder City, despite the fact that we barely tracked the top 50 for murder rates at the time. But something we've always been thinking of. I just love this one. 1920, shortly after alcohol became illegal, a guy called the Wandering Reporter and the Wandering Photographer went out to ask his question of the day, and he asked, how do you compare the new booze, bootleg liquor, with the old stuff on Clark Street between Austin Avenue, that would have been a Hubbard, I think, and Kinsey Street? J.W. Gibson says, there's a fight in every pint and a murder in every gallon. I used to drink the old stuff, but I'll tell the world I leave the new alone. He doesn't say that he never tried the new stuff. J.W. Johnson, bank chief vault clerk. I liked the old stuff better. It was much cheaper and he didn't feel so bummed the next AM. The only difference I see is they've raised the price of headaches. Once again, admits to having tried bootleg liquor. Next up, we've got Mr. Harry Brown. You could take half a dozen shots of the old stuff and never feel it. If you take 2 of the new, it's goodbye, George. His name isn't George. And this guy's like the one guy who won't admit to having tried it. Like, the effect is altogether different, judging by the stories I read in the papers. I would say the new booze excites a man to do things he would never have done under the influence of the old. Like, because of what my friend said. And Winsberg, because they can't get it, they want it all the more. The new stuff is causing more deaths each day. It knocks you off your feet, and after taking half a dozen shots, you want to climb a tree. So, half a dozen shots of the old stuff you couldn't feel, 2 shots of the new one, and it was goodbye, George, half a dozen, and you want to climb a tree. All of those quotes are just winners. But of course, by then there was just a young kid in Chicago by the name of Al Capone who would come to absolutely haunt Chicago history. We're going to go back a little bit further in history. In the early 20th century, there was a group called the Car Barn Bandits. Robert Lorgel tells me the book he's been working on them for about 20 years now is just about done. These were a few kids who, depending on how you look at it, were either the last of the old Wild West outlaws or the first of the organized mobsters. I wrote that a long time ago, and it's been copied and pasted into several other people's books ever since then. But these were a bunch of kids who had figured out the best way to make money. Why bother robbing the train when you could wait until the train parked and then rob it after it was in the barn, after they had collected all the payroll and everything. They ended up leaving the police on a daring chase before all of them were captured and arrested. And, I was just going through Johann Hawk's clemency file. There's one thing you find in clemency files is letters from randos to the governor. There was a letter written by Van Dien's mother, who apparently wrote on behalf of a lot of prisoners. And she was writing, it was to some completely other person that somehow got mixed into Hawk's clemency file. But it was very interesting to run across in there. These guys were captured partly by Officer Blowell, who you might know around here because he is not only the one guy who ever claims he really saw the ghost of Louise Lutker of the sausage factory murder, but also the main source of the stories of the sombrero ghost in Lincoln Park, a story that I tell quite a bit. But these guys were captured. It was a major story at the time. They were all hanged in 1904, though one of them, Niedermeyer, there in the middle, was known as a complete nut. He went to the gallows shouting curses and promising to curse everybody who was there. We're going to take a quick walk here. Now, we're going to move up to 1918 now, when things were starting to get more organized. We had gangs at the time, but it was mostly loosely affiliated guys guys who blew up safes together or teamed up on crimes that weren't as easy as otherwise. But if we were to take this tunnel through, we would end up at the old Illinois Central Railroad station. There actually was a shooting in here in the 1920s. There was a Chicago Tribune reporter was killed in here, Jake Lingle, in this station. It's all been retiled since then. But in 1918, there was a high-profile robbery of the train station. They were taking away the payroll, and 3 police were hurt in the battle. One of the robbers was killed. Others, this is, the 10th edition of the day that they published that day in 1918. In the Chicago Daily News, you never get more than 1 or maybe 2 editions preserved. Unlike the American, where you might get a dozen issues from one day preserved, or at least a dozen front pages. But this was, among the people who were involved in this robbing were Terrible Tommy O'Connor, who a couple of years later would escape from jail and never be caught. They had to keep the gallows in the basement for 70 years, 50 years after they stopped hanging people, because the sentence said he must hang. And also a young man by the name of Bugs Moran, who would later go on to become the head of the North Side Mob. At the same time, we had a lot of these other flashy guys who went around robbing people and commanding respect around the underworld, such as a guy by the name of Earl Bopp, who was held in the jail over here. Earl Bopp and Earl Deer, a lot of guys named Earl. But among the people who escaped along with Tommy O'Connor in 1921 was a guy by the name of Frank McErlin, who eventually came to be known as the first guy to use a Tommy gun, a Thompson submachine gun, as a Chicago gangster. He's one of a number of people who broke out along. One of them went on to marry Virginia Harrison, the woman who torched the Wind Blew In after probably dating the proprietress, Lillian Colley, for a while. Really, it's amazing how many of these things they don't really cover with all of these people. But Lloyd Bopp, Earl Deer, and Frank McErlin all broke out of prison together. Big Joe Moran, not to be confused with Bugs Moran. They were captured on the way out, but McErlin went on to become a Tommy gun shooter until late in life. One day they caught him on 78th Street, just shooting down the street, shooting at the ghosts of all the people he had killed. Or so it was said. He was kind of forced into retirement by the gangsters. We also, on the south side, in what is now Chinatown, but was then still kind of the Levee District, was Sam Cardinella's pool hall, which would have been located right about here. Now, when the cops raided this place and arrested all the kids inside of it, they said that this was a band of gangsters who had been taught to commit crimes at the pool hall by Sam Cardinella, who would then send them out on murders and robbery jobs, for which he would take most of the money. They confessed to something like 465 holdups and quite a number of murders. The police's theory was that Cardinella had been the entire ringleader of the thing, almost like he had read Oliver Twist and thought it was a how-to manual. But here's the thing, is in his pardon file, they make a very convincing case that most of these kids have been committing crimes since way before that pool hall was even open. There's even a number of affidavits where the prisoners would say, other prisoners said, I was talking to these guys, and I'm like, can you believe they're going to try to make me pin everything on that fruit cart guy? He doesn't even speak English, and they want me to say that he's some kind of a mastermind. There are hundreds and hundreds of signatures trying to get the guy off. And I do think they make a case not so much that he's innocent, but certainly that his role had been wildly exaggerated. But here's, the guy was illiterate. You can say here, Sam Cardinella, his mark, he had signed with an X, and then they put his name around it. You see that quite a bit. But the petition is hundreds of names long, and including people like Frank the Enforcer Nitti, which is right here under Frank R. Nitto. It's in here someplace. Quite a number of the big gangsters of a decade later are found among the petition here. I'm still going through it. I'm sure I haven't found all of them yet. It's kind of difficult to transcribe. This probably would have been set out at like Union Siciliana meetings and stuff. There are hundreds of pages like this. You could almost use it as like a directory. I haven't found Capone in there yet. I found one sloppy signature that looks like it almost might be him. But Frank R. Nitto, who would eventually take over for Capone under the name Frank the Enforcer Nitti, is in there. But among the people who were leading the charge to get Cardinella a pardon was a guy by the name of Mike Merlot, who was going to come up again. He was a leader in the Union Siciliana. It was officially a civic organization, but by the mid-20s was basically just a front for the mob. But he was the one who kind of kept the peace in the early days. So, right as about the time that Prohibition started in 1920, the big boss of Chicago, the vice lord of the Chicago, if you were running any kind of numbers racket or a brothel or something in the levee, you were paying off a guy by the name of Big Jim Colosimo, who operated a place called Colosimo's right about here on Wabash Street. It looked like this. It survived well into the 1960s. But the story goes that Big Jim got everybody together and said, listen, I know everybody's excited about bootleg liquor, but I don't think we should do that here in Chicago. For one thing, I just got married to one of my chorus girls. She wants me to straighten up and fly right, so I'm going to try to do it. We're still going to do gambling. We're still going to have brothels and all of that. But I don't think about bootleg liquor. Also, this is going to be dealing with the feds, not just the local police. It's a lot harder to bribe the feds. But this made him a target for absolutely everybody, and shortly after saying something like this, he was found shot to death inside of his cafe. Now, when asked about who she thought might have done it, his new wife said, I suspect everyone. But at this point, one of the guys who worked for him, Johnny Torrio, just got everybody together and said, okay, I'm the boss now. I don't think he would have really been talking like, I'm the leader around here now, see? Or anything like that. There were gangsters who talked like that, at least according to how they transcribed it in the press, though the press later said that they made that whole idea up. In the 1950s, they were saying they'd invented everything that ever happened. Torrio got everybody together and said, yes, we are in fact definitely going to be doing bootleg liquor here in Chicago. What we're not going to do is shoot at each other. We are just going to divide the city into territories. You take yours, we'll take ours. There is going to be plenty of money for everybody. There's really no reason to fight. That actually worked reasonably well for a while. Here's Colosimo's tomb. You might have seen this. We walked over to this after our cleanup at the Jewish section here at Oakwood Cemetery back in October. And notice that somebody has tossed a couple of bullets into Big Jim's place. Not to mention the fact that his name is misspelled. The date of death is wrong on the slab. Typos on graves are way more common than people think. But just a couple of years later, Al Capone, Torrio's young lieutenant that he had brought in from New York, made the news for the first time after going on a drunk driving rampage down Randolph Street in August of 1922. Well, he was driving drunk down Randolph, crashed his car into a parked taxi cab, then jumped out, started waving a pistol around saying he was going to shoot anybody who said that it was his fault. When they took him into the jail, or took him to the police station, he waved around a deputy sheriff's badge and started saying stuff like, "Don't you know who I am? I'm going to get every last one of you fired." He did somehow manage to use his pole to get the charges dropped, but my goodness, what a jerk he comes off as in this article. At the time, they were still calling him Al Capone. The newspapers never really did, in his day, get their heads around whether it was Capone or Capone, though he himself insisted, no, it's just Capone, no I at the end. This was a time when people would ask him, why don't you just go back to Italy? And he said, because I'm not an Italian. I was born in New York City 31 years ago. And then they would look at him and say, you're only 31? Because he looked about 61 by then. But this is Capone as a young, reckless 22 or 23-year-old kid. At the time, he did not have the PR skills that Torrio taught him. Torrio taught him the difference between saying, are you looking for trouble? And we don't want any trouble. It was always easier if you didn't have any trouble. But after this arrest, one of the places we can trace him to would be City Hall. This was built in 1911. This is one place that we can trace Capone to for sure. It's very difficult to find places around downtown that we can actually trace him to, really around Chicago or anywhere, places that are still standing. He is said to have been in practically every building in town, or to have owned practically every building in town, but it is almost never true. This one, there was a police station in here. This is where they brought him in to be booked. Some other places we can trace him around town would include the courthouse down over here. Well, this was the fire station where the jail was, and also where the gallows was when they set it up. You sometimes hear that they set out the gallows in the jail yard, but no, I think they set them up there now and then to hang sandbags to get the spring out of the rope. But the hangings were always done within the walls of the jail, at least after 1858. Well, this is the old criminal court building where the state's attorneys had their offices, and where Capone would have to go to get questioned every now and then. Like when Frank Capone his brother was shot, they brought him in for questioning. This is inside of that building. And also when a hitman by the name of John Duffy was killed. They had picked this guy up outside of Capone's place, the Four Deuces on 2222 South Wabash, a couple of blocks from Colosimo's. He had been hired by the Dino Banyan gang, the gang that was running the north side at the time, as a hitman. He bragged about what a great shot he was, but then he never really shot anybody. So finally, they just ended up shooting him. Capone, they made sure to pick him up outside of the Four Deuces so that Capone would be a suspect. And he just said, I'm just a businessman. For no reason at all, everybody is always trying to pin something on me. He was going by Al Brown here at the time. He admitted that he knew O'Banion, but hadn't seen him in a while. Was able to establish that, no, he didn't own the Four Deuces, the notorious resort, also known as Alphonse Scar-Faced Capone. But the Four Deuces would have been right around here. It looked like this. It's called the Four Deuces because the address was 2222 South Wabash. Here's how it looked much later. There was a rumor right around then that he had been shot to death. Rumors flew through the underworld last night that Al Capone, better known as Al Brown, proprietor of the notorious Four Deuces on Wabash, had been shot. Others were that he had been killed. Cicero and Chicago police spent a busy 2 hours running the rumors down. Brown was reached at his home early this morning and denied that he had been shot, much less killed. Greatly exaggerated, said Capone. Around the same time, there was the issue of the Duffy murder. Where once again, yes, most despicable resort ever kept anywhere, and always known as cheating between raids. Used his revolver frequently, women often informed the police to serve his own purposes. Took up booze as a means of getting pocket money when the vice profession was dull. He was under the wing of Torrio, worked with O'Banion, Miller, or anyone else who could show him the way to ill-gotten gains. Said had been among those present when Duffy started on the journey of death, the first one-way ride. But eventually, Dean O'Banion, mentioned here, started double-crossing Torrio too much. For a long time, he didn't dare to do anything about it because Mike Merlot said no killings. Mike Merlot was head of the Union Siciliana. Even if you were the head of the mob, you didn't mess with the head of the Union Siciliana. But then Mike Merlot died of natural causes. And while setting up for the funeral, Dean O'Banion operated Schofield's Flowers, where the new One Chicago building stands. This was filmed when it was still under construction. I should really go out there and fix this up. But there was a place, Schofield's Flower Shop. I think he probably usually worked at the version of Schofield's that was up on Broadway near Devon. It was much closer to O'Banion's house. But Mike Merlot's funeral was likely to be a really big deal. People, this was the beginning of the era of big gangster funerals where there were to be literally truckload after truckload of flowers showing up. So O'Banion went to work at that day. It was his day job. He had bought into the place right after his wedding. A few guys came in and said, "Hey, are you guys from Mike Merlot?" At this point, they gave him what we call the Chicago handshake. We'll just check out quickly here. This is Mike Merlot's tomb down at Mount Carmel Cemetery, where nearly all of these guys ended up. This is a picture of outside of his house, just all of the floral tributes pouring in. And not too far down the way from there, not too far, is also the tomb of the Jenner brothers, who operated a place here on Taylor Street. But they are sometimes said to have been the people who came in to shoot Dean O'Banion. They walked into Schofield's Flower Shop, acted like they were shaking his hand. He said, "Hey, are you guys here, boys here from Merlot?" And then they shot him several times. We'll move in elsewhere here. O'Banion was also buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery. There was a person at one of the Jenner brothers' funerals said, "Yeah, there's Mike Merlot's over there and O'Banion's over there. When Judgment Day comes and then tombs open up, there's going to be hell to pay in this cemetery." But here's Dean. This also is figures into, there's a bit of a controversy about whether his name was spelled D-E-A-N or D-I-O-N, whether it was Dean or Dion. And one thing I notice is he's referred to as Dion quite a lot at a certain time when people wouldn't have been able to see it written down. I think it was probably spelled Dean, but often pronounced like Dion or Dion. But all of the paperwork has it as Dean. But this is what they had in the headline the next day. O'Banion gang like pirates of olden days. Beer trucks their gold ships. See, even in 1924, people were really getting into the mythology of the gangsters. There's right after that, there was a rumor that Capone had been shot in retaliation. But really, in retaliation, there's a bunch of different retaliations for this. For one, John Torrio himself was living down over here on South Clyde Street. And January of 1925, a group of 3 guys from the north side coming to get revenge rode up here and shot him 3 times in the face. They were just about to give him like the coup de grace, the final shot, but then the gun ran out of bullets or jammed up or something. But among those who came to do the shooting were Vinny the Schemer Drucci, Bugs Moran, and Jaime Weiss. So Torrio was not killed. He was just shot in the face. He was put in jail for a long time and turned everything over to Al Capone. Decided to quit while he was ahead, move out to New York. At that point, he may have been pulling the strings from afar for a long time after that, kind of depending on who you asked. But apparently said, "Okay, kid, it's all yours." That's been given as an exact quote many times, but it only goes back to like the 1970s. Now, in revenge, Jaime Weiss was shot down right across the street from a Schofield's Flower Shops on the steps of the Holy Name Cathedral. They love to say, well, some of the tour guides in the city love to say that this little hole in the cornerstone is really from a bullet hole. It is in fact not. This is where they used to have a plaque hanging up. But there are places around this cornerstone where you can see where they had to rebuild it and cover it up after the damage that was sustained. Tommy gun bullets don't really make holes that look like that. So Jaime himself also ended up at Mount Carmel Cemetery. And so did Vinny the Schemer Drucci. Vinny the Schemer, they called him that because he was always coming up with ideas like, why don't we go to London and steal the crown jewels? Why don't we run one of our guys for mayor or for president even? But then during one of the local elections, they rounded up all the usual suspects. Over the Clark Street Bridge, he was said to be reaching for the officer's gun, so the officer shot Vinny the Schemer Drucci to death. Many people said the cop had murdered him, but at the same time, nobody was really that sad to see Vinny the Schemer Drucci go, so the matter was not particularly pursued. So this left Al Capone in charge of everything. We'll actually go down here. This is Capone's house. You always hear that Capone owned buildings all over the place. Really, he did not have a lot of real estate holdings. He was trying to effect that he did not have any income whatsoever. So what he did own was this house down on 7244 South Prairie, the bigger one here. We actually got a picture of the house as it looked at the time. You can still see that same house next door to it, too. They've redone the windows a little bit since then. Like yesterday, we say that, they've always done, over the course of 100 years, they've done a little bit of changes. This is the house as it appeared in 1924 during the funeral of Anthony Capone, who was killed by the police. Quick look up over here. 1926, there was a big raid against the Capones. Shortly after the shooting of an assistant state's attorney named William McSwiggan. Now, McSwiggan was out on the west side with members of the O'Donnell gang, and nobody could explain why. This was the most straight-laced assistant state's attorney in town, but all of a sudden he was out hanging out with gangsters. Some people say that he was just trying to gather information. Some people are saying that he was just old friends with them from the neighborhood. Other people say he must have been in on the take. Nobody really knew. But after this, this was really Capone's biggest mistake, was having this guy killed. He might not have even meant to. He might have been trying to shoot the O'Donnells, but McSwiggan was out there too. Here's Capone, 26 years old. And here is Detective Sergeant John W. Norton digging through Ralph Capone's house, finding all these places where he's been using, like hiding rifles in the curtain rods, secret passages all over the house. You got to wonder if he flashed back to 30 years before at that point, when he'd been digging around through the H.H. Holmes castle. He was the main detective on that scene, though they never talked about it anymore in 1926. I'm sorry, the cats are playing Horse Stampede back over there. So we'll move on up to the late 1920s, 1928, right here where the Chase Tower is now. There was a guy in New York that Capone had worked for named Frankie Yale, who was then killed apparently by members of the North Side Gang. I think the general theory is Capone brought in people to kill Frankie Yale because he had switched allegiance over to the North Side Gang. But then there was a new head of the Union Siciliana. We've skipped over a few different leaders of the Union, but by then, being the head of the Union Siciliana meant you were the most powerful man in the city. It also meant that everybody wanted to kill you, so nobody really lived that long in that position. It was one of those jobs like Speaker of the House. People will give up everything to get it, and then you're giving everything up for an absolutely terrible job. But Lombardo was shot right here at Madison and Dearborn, right at rush hour, too. This was one of the most public hits the mob ever did. Lombardo, too, is at Mount Carmel Cemetery now. Now, this was said at the time to have been revenge for the Frankie Yale killing, though nobody really knew at the time. For the most part, the gangsters hadn't been shooting at each other that much for the last year or so. Also, check out through the tunnel over here. One guy who was thought to have possibly known something about it was a Tribune reporter named Jake Lingle. Now, Lingle was one of those guys, he was a footman, not a rewrite man. He would go around gathering data, then he would just call it back into rewrite. There was even some suggestion that he might have been functionally illiterate himself. But he knew everybody. He'd go into, gambling dens in Chinatown and know everybody by their first name. Just walking around taking notes, gathering all the data, getting the scoop, then calling back and shouting, "Get me a rewrite." But he was shot to death in this tunnel. It turned out he was also not only reporting on the gangsters, he was also probably working for some of them, too. At this point, Capone decided it was probably time to get out of town. So he made tracks for Miami. He spent more time in Miami than he did in Chicago, honestly, at least after he came into power, and shouted, "You can all go thirsty." It's Al Capone's abuse. We'd always say things like, when they serve this stuff on Lakeshore Drive, it's hospitality. When I do it, it's a crime. That may not be an exact quote. There's a lot of those that came out of movies and stuff that tend to get attributed to him. But he did say something like that. But while he was gone came probably the most famous event in Chicago gangland history. We just covered this, so I won't get too much into it. But right here on 2100 North Clark Street was the SMC Cartage Company garage, where Valentine's Day of 29, 7 guys affiliated with the Bugs Moran gang were lined up against the wall like it was a regular old liquor raid and shot down. Well, I won't leave the gruesome image lingering up there. But this has always been assumed to be Al Capone's doing. He was out of town at the time, so he certainly wasn't directly responsible. There are those who say that he had nothing to do with it. It was some whole other thing. That's not very well regarded by historians. It's generally seen to have generally been assumed that because of this, Capone rises to supreme command of the underworld. Moran himself was late that day. He was apparently supposed to be showing up, but ducked into a cafe instead. Among those killed, up at Rose Hill Cemetery, you don't really find gangsters too often in the North Side cemeteries. They're usually, they're in the Catholic cemeteries usually. Except for Reinhard Schwimmer, who officially was not a gangster. He was just an optometrist who liked to hang out with gangsters. That's his mother's story anyway. It's remarkable how much we've assumed that was true because he said that. But another Frank Gusenberg was not quite dead when the police showed up to this SMC Cartage Company. When asked who did it, he said nobody shot nobody. Gotta be a gangster right to the end. Now, we've generally thought that it was a couple of guys, a group from Missouri that Capone occasionally worked with. One of their wives called them the American Boys. I've always kind of figured that we've underestimated the idea that it might have been Scalisi and Anselmi, just because shooting all 7 people but not the guy who was presumably the target is exactly the kind of boneheaded thing that Scalisi and Anselmi would have done. These were phenomenally dumb guys. But shortly after this might explain why they were found tied up and beaten to death with either baseball bats or golf clubs. There's memorable scenes in movies where, a baseball bat and a baseball, you got 9 players on a team. And if you're not for us, then you're against us. Memorably done, but we really don't know whether that actually happened or not. Might have been that way. They can tell it very memorably on the gangster tours. But McGurn, for his part, Machine Gun Jack McGurn is also often said to have been the shooter here. Just because it was done very skillfully, not many people could really do that good of a job shooting with a machine gun in those days. But a few years later, he was shot to death. The gangsters who did it left a valentine by his feet, saying, "You've lost your jewels, you've lost your dough, you're bred in handsome houses, but hey, things could be worse, you know. You haven't lost your trousers." Let's check out just a few other places. There's a few other gangster sites of interest. One guy who was always trying to take over Capone's job and assassinate Capone was a guy by the name of Joe Aiello, who lived over here by Indian Boundary Park. Just down the road in the place where there is now there's now a frozen custard shop, they found he had stashed a lot of dynamite that he was planning to use to blow up Capone. He was eventually shot outside of a place on the south side. His funeral was at the house. He wasn't shot at the house. Right around the corner was the house of a racketeer named Big Tim Murphy. And this is one place you actually can see the bullet holes here from when he was mowed down. I won't linger on him too much. It's a person's house now. But this one actually is some damage from bullets in the bricks. Capone for a while had a headquarters at the Metropole Hotel down here on Cullerton. And then after coming back to Chicago in about 1930 and 31 during the time of his trial, he more famously operated on Michigan Avenue at the old Lexington Hotel, which looked like this. This is the place where they famously found his vault in the 1980s, where Geraldo Rivera embarked on a long series of public humiliations and failures after a high-profile breaking into Al Capone's vault, where really Capone wasn't even in this place that much. It seems rather unlikely that he would have had much in there. But it was, this was where Capone had probably his most famous office. By most accounts, he had several rooms in the place, in some accounts an entire floor of the place. Frank Lesh was a businessman in Chicago who ran a group of guys who were dedicated to getting rid of Capone. They were the ones who brought in Elliot Ness and the Untouchables. But he actually had a meeting with Capone here when an election was coming up, saying, "Listen, I know you guys like to mess with elections. Can you just do me a solid and not do it this time. And Capone was in a generous mood. Frank told this story for years and years, sometimes varying who Capone had a picture of on his back wall. Sometimes he said it was George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Sometimes he said he had a picture of the mayor, Big Bill Thompson. It kind of depends on which point Frank Lesh was running to make at the time. Capone was pretty good with public relations by then. Most famously, he had a soup kitchen down here at 935 South State Street. And this came up in his trials, like, hey, he's a good guy. He, in fact, had a soup kitchen. Sissy Patterson did a very interesting interview with him down in Miami. She came down and just found him outside. He said, yeah, sure, I'll talk to somebody from the Washington newspaper. She was the one who was amazed to find out that he was only like 31, saying, why can't they let me alone? She closed her article by saying, women have a special affinity with gangsters. If you don't understand why, consult Dr. Freud. But generally, he was a hard man to find. In the early 1930s, Des Moines Register reporter came to Chicago and spent a couple of weeks just trying to find him. He got like one glimpse of him going into an elevator, talked to a guy who had written a biography of Capone, and had also never met him or spoken to him. Because of stuff like this, that's part of why all of the urban legends come around. But we can trace him here to the old federal court building, not this building, but this location. He was put on trial in here when they finally arrested him for tax evasion. We can trace him, but during the trial we found out that he in fact got all of his underwear made at Marshall Fields. So we can trace him to the Marshall Fields with some degree of authority. Custom tailored union suits that cost him like $20 a pair, made out of ladies' glove silk, which the jury thought was hilarious. And next to the federal building would have been the Marquette building, where during his trial he would duck over into the Marquette building to have lunch in his lawyer's office. This is generally the kind of place we can trace him to. We can trace him to like a building where he is known to have had lunch. Not places where he threw parties, not places that he owned. Or perhaps like Dearborn Station, the one that you can see from the one that I can trace into something where you can see from the boats, just briefly, Dearborn Station. He changed trains here on the way to prison. And this switch of trains is also the only time he is known to have been in the same place at the same time as Elliot Ness, the Untouchables guy. Among the more famous stories about where he hung out would be the Jewelers Building, this older one here with the dome up on top. This commonly said that he either owned or frequented a speakeasy here called the Stratosphere Club. And the Stratosphere Club was a real place, but it didn't open until years after Capone was in prison and liquor was legal again. There's no reason whatsoever to think he would have been there. Just boat tours love to say it. It kind of drives me nuts. He's also frequently said to have hung out at the Green Mill, despite general lack of evidence and generally being in the wrong side of town. There is some gangster history there. Tex Guinan used to show off there. There were occasional car chases as well. Here's a woman who ran basically the last gasp of vaudeville. She would come in and she would insult people and throw things at them, and they just ate it up. They loved it. There's also a singer named Joe Lewis who was switching contracts while singing here and then was attacked. They tend to say he was attacked at the place. It was really in his hotel room. And then he was back there a while later. Some of the legends about that come from a 1950s biography of him, The Joker is Wild. But we can trace, there are some first-hand accounts that are a little bit better of Capone at other places, like down in Bronzeville. This beauty shop is the location of the old Sunset Cafe, which in the 40s became the Grand Terrace Ballroom, where Earl Father Hines and his band would do radio broadcasts. Sometimes we played those around here. And here is Earl himself talking about Capone coming into the place. So it's a first-hand account. It's from years and years later, but first-hand account.
Al came in there and one night and called the whole band and show together and said, now, we want to let you know our position. He says, we just want you people to tend to your own business. We'll give you all the protection in the world. He says, we want you to be like the three monkeys. You hear nothing, you see nothing, and you say nothing. And that's what we did. And I used to hear many things, many of the things that they were going to do, but I never to tell anyone. And sometimes the police used to come always looking for a fall guy used to come in and say, Earl, what were they talking about? I said, I don't know. So, well, you were sitting right there. I said, yeah, I sit on the bus too, but I don't pay attention to what people are saying. So I said, no, you're not going to pick me, because they had a habit of putting the pictures of these different people that would bring information in the paper. And the next day you find them out there in the lake somewhere, swimming around there with some chains attached to their feet and all that, you know what I mean?
That's kind of a mixture of fact and fiction there from Earl Father Hines. Let's take a quick look, though, at the graves of some of these guys. Well, mainly, let's take a look at the Capone plot. It's also at Mount Carmel. Initially buried at Mount Olivet, that they quietly had him moved to a new family plot down at Mount Carmel. The original gravestone is still standing at Mount Olivet, where there was our first in-person Find a Grave Friday. Hey, what is up? There he is, Alphonse Capone, my Jesus mercy. Recently got spray painted. Somebody spray painted the word evil onto this, but that just means the cemetery is going to have to clean it up. If you have that much of a grudge against somebody, just do a little dance. I don't understand people leaving him tokens. This was not a good guy. We'll also check up in Lakeview Cemetery while we were there in Cleveland. I did manage to go get the cenotaph that is there for Elliot Ness of the Untouchables, who after beating Al Capone, or at least partially assisting in getting Al Capone, moved on to pretty much drinking himself to death. But all right, everybody, that brings us to the end of that particular gangster era. Very short overview of it. So from there, we will just put the Benny Goodman back on and hang out. I don't have anything to plug for the next week. It is my off season. All I do is research and work on books this time of year. But the Patreon is, of course, always and always ongoing. Yeah, there we go. Patreon.com/AdamChicago. You get a Chicago history story every week and a coyote in the cemetery photo every week. One tier up for an extra couple bucks a month, you get deep research, where I add some of the vintage articles on the whatever we're researching for Chicago history that week. And then it's here with all of our favorite antique serial killers. Johann Hawk, on who I'm doing a book right now. H.H. Holmes, The Last Guy. A lot of people from the H.H. Holmes saga make cameos in the Johann Hawk book. It's kind of good to have these recurring characters. But all right, everybody, I'm Adam Seltzer for Mysterious Chicago Tours, ready to answer your questions about Al Capone having a hideout in your hometown. Short answer, probably not. And here's Benny Goodman and Helen Ward with Alone, live from the Congress Hotel, where a phone call was placed to Capone right after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Thanks, everybody. Yikes, Kathleen. That is waking up late. I can never sleep that late. Cats are back behind me running back and forth. Nice lemons. Yeah, I can't sleep late for the life of me, no matter how late I get to bed. And now and then there are a couple of stories about guys being chained up and thrown in the river. We found a couple of those. The cement shoe thing, I don't know if anybody ever actually found. Maybe Miles was watching, but then he and Priya have been chasing each other back and forth over here. I'll find him in a minute. Yeah, well, there were definitely gangsters in Milwaukee, too. But really, there's hardly, it's a common thing that we always laugh about as Chicago tour guys when we get together. How many people get off of the bus or the boat or whatever and say, yeah, I'm from Tinkle Dribble, Mississippi. I know you know all about that. That's like, well, Capone had his resort there. Like, if we made a map of all of the places where people told us Capone had his resort or his hideout, like, man, that guy got around. Miles. Capone was scared of the Purple Gang. He was scared of pretty much everybody. That's the one thing. He kept a pretty low profile. He spent most of his time ducking in and out of the side entrances of B-list hotels. Or getting off in far-flung train stations, not Union Station, because there were so many people who wanted to kill the guy. Just a lot of people wanted to kill this guy. I've always joked that one day Al Capone, Charlie Chaplin, and Johnny Weissmuller must have gone around the North Side, just stepping into every building, just to make sure all the urban legends would be true. I imagining all three of them popping in hello, 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 goodbye, and then they're gone. Brother have a bar in Hurley, Wisconsin. Hurley doesn't ring a bell, but his brother Ralph had places all over Michigan and Wisconsin. Or spent some time in them anyway. Usually I haven't looked up enough of the far-flung town stuff, but there's way more stories than are true. I'd be playing the odds pretty well if I just said no to all of them. Oh, we got both cats hanging out over here. Up there goes Priya. We did have both cats here a second ago. Hey, Miles. Hanging out over here by the piano. Just looking out the window. How many likes do I have now? I don't know. On this page, in the range of we're not quite the 40,000, I don't think.
When they're goody good and coupled with the singing of Helen Ward, well, it's just something. Benny Goodman, swing it.
I was just mentioning, Layla and I did a couple of tours of the Aragon Ballroom a few months ago, and when walking around it, there's a ledge among the staff, both there and at the Chicago Theater, that the booth right by the stage was the Capone booth. This is where Capone would come in to watch the shows. No way, man. He would have been a sitting duck. Priya's gotten a lot better at wanting to be on camera, but still, no, she's not as into it. Oh yeah, Gina, police records from those days, you don't come across much. Unless it was a really big trial, you might be able to get like somebody's clemency reports or something, or stuff that would make the state archives, or coroner's reports, or homicide databases. Yeah, police records from back then are like scattered and few and far between places. Burnham Woods Golf Course, I think that might be the place where Capone shot himself in the scrotum. I can't remember exactly which golf course that was. But yeah, he had like a firearm in his golf bag, and it went off. And, you know, they tried to deny this story, but you can see from like medical reports in the jail, no, he shot a hole in one.
Well, plus leaving you with a smile, Benny Goodman leaves you swinging. Transcontinental.
Yeah, the caddy wrote about it years later for like Sports Illustrated or something. There were reports of it at the time, but they tried to brush it all off at the time. But no, he shot a hole in his sack. Out of the bag and into the sack. Yeah, Capone. Yeah, Denise Capone was married. There's also, I've got some like some of the records from like his psychological test in prison. He was apparently suffering the effects of syphilis by then.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have been swinging right down the airways.
And definitely, you know, you can definitely see his mind had deteriorated badly when you read the when you read stuff like his he forgot which one was plus and which was minus. His grasp of basic figures and math were very, very bad. And after that, he had, you know, good days and bad days. Stories about him fishing in the empty pool are mostly, again, from movies, but it was probably about like that. All right, well, that has Benny Goodman wrapping up, so I think it is time that I wrapped up as well. And got back to my task of the day, which is finally getting the dishes under control. So thanks a lot for joining me, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. We will be back tomorrow morning for Mural Monday. And until then, stay safe and stay strong. And of course, if you can, ladies and gentlemen, stay spooky, everybody. Have a great day.